Friends, it is Tuesday, April 21st. The orphans had a brief hope that the engine would not start when Stefano turned the key in the ignition, but this was a futile hope. Uncle Monty took good care of his Jeep, and it started right up. Violet, Klaus, and Sonny looked behind them as Stefano began to drive alongside the snake-shaped hedges. At the sight of the reptile room, which Uncle Monty had filled so carefully with his specimens, and which he was now sort of a specimen himself, the weight of the Baudelaire's despair was too much for them, and they began to quietly cry. It is a curious thing, the death of a loved one. We all know that our time in the world is limited, and that eventually all of us will end up underneath some sheet, never to wake up. And yet, it's always a surprise when it happens to someone we know. It's like walking up the stairs to your bedroom in the dark and thinking that there's one more stair than there is, and your foot falls down through the air. And there is that sickly moment of dark surprise as you try and readjust the way you thought of things. The Baudelaire orphans were crying not only for their Uncle Monty, but for their own parents, and this dark and curious feeling of falling that accompanies any great loss. What was to happen to them? Stefano had heartlessly slaughtered the man who was supposed to be watching over the Baudelaires, and now they were all alone. What would Stefano do to them? He was supposed to be left behind when they went to Peru, and now he would be leaving with them on the Prospero. And what terrible things would happen in Peru? Would anyone rescue them there? Would Stefano get his hands on the fortune? And what would happen to the three children afterwards? These are frightening questions, and if you're thinking about such matters, they require your full attention. And the orphans were so immersed in thinking about them that they didn't realize that Stefano was about to collide with another automobile until the moment of impact. There was a horrible tearing sound of metal and glass as a black car crashed into Uncle Monty's Jeep, throwing the children to the floor with a jarring thump that felt as though it left the Baudelaire stomachs up on the seat. The black suitcase lurched into Violet's shoulder and then forward into the windshield, which immediately cracked in a dozen places so that it looked like a spider web. Stefano gave a cry of surprise and turned the steering wheel this way and that, but the two vehicles were locked together and, with another thump, veered off the road into a small pile of mud. It is a rare occurrence when a car accident can be called a stroke of good fortune, but that was most certainly the case here. With the snake-shaped hedges still clearly visible behind them, the Baudelaire's journey towards Hazy Harbor had stopped. Stefano gave another sharp cry, this one of rage. "Blasted furnaces of hell!" he shouted as Violet rubbed her shoulder to make sure she wasn't seriously hurt. Klaus and Sonny got up cautiously from the Jeep floor and looked out the cracked windshield. There appeared to be only one person in the other car, but it was hard to tell, as that vehicle had clearly suffered much more damage than Uncle Monty's Jeep. Its entire front had pleated itself together like an accordion, and one hubcap was spinning noiselessly on the pavement of Lousy Lane, making blurry circles as if it were a giant coin that someone had dropped. The driver was dressed in gray and making a rough hacking sound as he opened the crumpled door of the car and struggled his way out. I think we know who that's going to be. And here is a picture of Stefano. Getting out of the car. The driver was dressed in gray and making a rough hacking sound as he opened the crumpled door of the car and struggled his way out. He made the hack sound again, and then reached into the pocket of his suit and pulled out a white handkerchief. "It's Mr. Poe!" Klaus cried. It was Mr. Poe, coughing away as usual, and the children were so delighted to see them that they found themselves smiling despite their horrible circumstances. "Mr. Poe! Mr. Poe!" Violet cried, reaching around Stefano's suitcase to open the passenger door. Stefano reached out an arm and grabbed her sore shoulder, reaching his head slowly so that the child saw his shiny eyes. "This changes nothing," he hissed at them. "This is a bit of luck for you, but it is your last. The three of you will be back in this car with me and heading towards Hazy Harbor in time to catch the Prospero. I promise you that. We'll see about that, Violet replied, opening the door and sliding out from beneath the suitcase. Klaus opened his door and followed her, carrying Sonny. Mr. Poe, Mr. Poe. Violet? Mr. Poe asked. Violet Baudelaire. Is that you? Yes, Mr. Poe, Violet said. It's all of us, and we're so grateful that you ran into us. Well, I wouldn't say that, Mr. Poe said. This was clearly the other driver's fault. You ran into me. How dare you! Stefano shouted and got out of the car himself, wrinkling his nose at the smell of horseradish that filled the air. He stomped over to where Mr. Poe was standing, but halfway there the children saw his face change from one of pure rage to one of brummagem, confusion, and sadness. Oh, I'm sorry, he said in a high, fluttery voice. This whole thing is my fault. Oh, I am so distressed by what has happened that I wasn't paying any attention to the rules of the road. I hope you are not hurt, Mr. Poe. Well, I am not hurt. Luckily, it looks like nobody was hurt. I wish the same could be said for my car, but who are you, and what are you doing with the Baudelaire children? I'll tell you who he is, Klaus said. He's... Oh, please, Klaus, Mr. Poe admonished. A word which here means reprimanded Klaus, even though he was interrupting for a very good reason. It is not polite to interrupt. My name is Stefano, Stefano said, shaking Mr. Poe's hand. I was Dr. Montgomery's assistant. What do you mean was? Mr. Poe asked sternly. Were you fired? No, Dr. Montgomery... Oh, excuse me. Stefano turned away and pretended to dab his eyes as if he were too sad to continue. Facing away from Mr. Poe, he gave the orphans a big wink before continuing. I'm sorry to tell you there's been a horrible accident, Mr. Doe. Dr. Montgomery is dead. Poe, my name is Poe, Mr. Poe said. Well, he's dead. Well, that's terrible. What has happened? Well, I don't know, Stefano said. It looks like a snake bite to me, but I don't know anything about snakes. Oh, that's why I was going into town to get a doctor. The children seem too upset to be left alone. He's not taking us to get a doctor, Klaus shouted. He's taking us to Peru. And that's where we will stop. Have a good day. Remember, if you need any help, go on to Google Stream, find our Zoom site. I'm Zooming with 6th and 7th graders from 2 o'clock to 2:45, Monday through Friday. So if you want to drop in and do your homework with me, we can do that. All right, and have a good Tuesday.